Hello, welcome to this 10-minute tech talk. Today we're going to discuss what is acceptable color and how can you define it, how can you measure it, and what are some of the issues that we may get into when we're trying to define an acceptable match. So, determining what's acceptable can be challenging because if you have three people, say for example, evaluating color, each one of them is going to see a slightly different version of that color. There's a number of things that can come into play. It can be the lighting that's going on, it can be the age of the observer, it can be the sex of the observer, male and female. We tend to see color a little bit differently, or they do and we do. So there's some things we'll talk about there. But the main thing is that everybody has a slightly different perception of color. So using our eyes as the methodology, if you will, to define acceptable is not going to work. So today we're going to talk about what are some of the other ways that you can define color and look at color differently so that you can get a more definitive color match. So some interesting facts about color. We measured two similar, not identical, but in the sense that they were both the Pantone solid color guides. We compared 452 patches, and we found that we had a max deviation between two similar colors of 9.46 delta E. That's very, very high, and it considered a not an acceptable match. 22% of those colors were over 3 delta E. Now, what we used was the Pantone Color swatch book. You can load that into the X-Rite Exact, which is a handheld spectrophotometer. You can load in the supplied LEB values into that, and then you can compare that to the printed version from Pantone. So we had a very definitive color library that was supplied by Pantone, and we compared that to their actual Pantone matchbooks, and we had some very high delta E variables. In our industry, we would say that anything above a 2.5 delta E would be considered not a great color match. Most customers would not accept a color match above a 2.5 delta E. And the difference between two Pantone guides was higher than our industry standard. So keep that in mind when you're using the physical books for a reference for color. I've seen pressmen take the actual book, measure the book, and then compare that to the printed sheet. You're better to go to the supplied LAB values from Pantone. That way you are going back to the source and you're not adding to your tolerance set by taking into, measuring a slightly deviated standard. So the books are great. They're a really good starting point, but they can have fairly high variations. And again, the takeaway here is to use a loaded, supplied from Pantone, either spectral or LAB library that you can load into your device so that you're completely zeroing. You're starting at zero and then you're measuring against that. Okay. Another fun fact is that men tend to lose their ability to see the subtle differences in color as they age. Men, as they start to enter into their 50s, tend to lose, not all, but some men tend to lose the ability to see subtle differences in color. Women tend to hold on to that ability to see subtle variations in color later in life. They tend to see more variations within the color. So, women can be, their eyes can be a little bit more accurate than men, and that's just a fact of life. Red is the first color that a baby sees. I read it on the internet, so it's got to be true. White is the safest car that you can buy, the color for a car. And in a black car, because really it's the absence of color, they're not as easy to see, tend to be more involved in a crash. And interestingly enough, chickens are very sensitive to brightly colored lights. I did not know that. So there's some fun facts about color. When comparing color, it's important to understand that we use the terminology delta E and what that means. So delta E or DE comes in a number of different variations of formulas. You may see delta E 2000, delta E CMC, delta E delta A star AB, delta E 76, and the list goes on. I use delta E 2000. This is the formula. It is one of the more recent formulas, and it tends to help to what we see visually compared to what we were measuring. We would say this is a 2.5 delta E, but our eye would say this is a very, very close color match. So delta E 2000 tends to bridge that gap between what we see with our eye, as it tends to help with the lighter colors to be, slightly differently formulated than the darker colors, and give slightly different tolerance to those ones. So it tends to match more closely to what we are seeing, and it is the industry standard for what we use within the printing industry. So Delta 2000 would be my choice if you were to pick one, and be the one that we would use. So yeah, that's the things about that. So the best way to control color is really to remove the subjectivity and use a handheld device. The SpectraDens from Teshcon and the Exact from X-Rite are two of the main ones in our industry. They are both excellent devices. Some people have fallen towards the X-Rite just because it's been the standard of the industry. It uses that sort of stapler measurement, system. We have to press down. The SpectraDens, you basically just put it on the color and click, click, click. You don't have to lift it each time. So I find there's advantages to that SpectraDens. I really like that functionality to it. X-Rite is a little bit more, it's been the one that's out there, been out there the longest. But they're both excellent devices, and I really couldn't say one is better than the other. It comes down to personal preference. So one thing that's very cool is on each of these devices, you can load in your customer's colors. So if you had customer X and they had 6 colors that they have approved within your production, and I have another video on there that talks about how to load spot colors into your devices, you can then enter a tolerance set into your device, and you can put in a pass-fail for the color, and you can then use the device to measure throughout the production run how your colors are being accepted, or sorry, not accepted, but they're being printed, and if they are acceptable. So what are some of the tolerances that we can use within the graphic arts industry? There's really 3 levels. The main one I would say is that keeping your color under 2.5 delta E would be the goal, and that's delta E 2000. But it depends on the device that you're using and the limitations of that device. For example, an offset press may have a variation of 2.5 throughout the run. You could pull a sheet, and some of the older presses, you could pull a sheet every 50 sheets and get a significant variation of like 2.5 delta E from sheet to sheet. That's not uncommon. Some of the new inkjet presses, for example, the new Fuji J Press 720, we're seeing that is keeping the delta E at around a 1 quite easily from start to finish for months at end. So it's imperative to know what the tolerance of your device is, and then to be able to translate that to an acceptable tolerance. So what is our takeaway here? Our eyes are not a very good judge of color. We really need to use a handheld device, a spectrophotometer device, to qualify and quantify color. This removes the subjectivity that one would have when evaluating color. We certainly learned that both men and women see color differently, and as we age, our eyes are not as accurate, especially with men, and that tends to come in a little earlier. There is a great test at xrite.com/hue/test that one can take. I'll put a link in this video at the end so you can take a look at that test. And what it makes you do is sort of match up colors of similar color, and it'll tell you how accurate your eyes are at seeing color. And you can do that on the screen. It works on any monitor. The monitor doesn't have to be calibrated. Of course, not evaluating color. We're just trying to evaluate color differences. So it's a neat test to be able to take, and I've taken that from time to time, and so far I'm still scoring 100, and I'm certainly not as young as I used to be, so that's great. So I hope that's a good takeaway from you, and you learned something new about color. I look forward to talking to you in the next video. Thank you. Bye.